Minerals and metals are key for all digital products. As the world embraces digital technologies and transitions to greener energy sources, demand for these resources has increased and will continue to rise significantly as we decarbonize our economy. Extracting these resources often causes severe environmental damage and negative societal impacts. Ensuring due diligence in global mineral value chains has therefore become increasingly important. Although there are numerous due diligence initiatives, guidelines, and recommendations in place today, companies struggle to overlook long and global value chains. To support companies in better analyzing and designing their mineral supply chains, the OECD has developed a handbook on environmental due diligence in collaboration with a broad diversity of stakeholders. It provides guidance and empowers companies to assess and manage risks, but also supports them to identify opportunities. Today, I have the pleasure to talk with 4 experts who were intensively involved in developing this new handbook. Sophia Ginnig is policy analyst at the OECD Center for Responsible Business Conduct, and she is the lead author of the new handbook. Rashad Abelson is Technology Sector Lead at the OECD Center for Responsible Business Conduct and co-author of the handbook. Jan Kosmoll is Scientific Policy Advisor at the German Environment Agency. He was the co-chair of the expert working group for the handbook, and he also was a sort of founding father of the whole idea to develop such a handbook. And Gudrun Franken is head of the unit Mining and Sustainability at the German Federal Institute for Geosciences and Natural Resources, in short BGR, and she was co-chair of the expert working group. Sophia, let's talk about target groups of the handbook. What sort of companies does the OECD Handbook for Environmental Due Diligence in Mineral Supply Chains address? Any specific sectors, or is it of relevance for all companies?
So due diligence itself is really a whole of supply chain process, and it applies to all businesses from large multinationals to SMEs, as well as all business relationships, including those relationships that go beyond contractual first tier or immediate relationships. And what this means in practice is that all companies along mineral supply chains, from the point of extraction to the end product manufacturer, really have a role to play in due diligence. The nature of a company's role in the due diligence process, however, can be affected very much by its position in the supply chain. In supply chains with key points of transformation, like smelters and refiners in the minerals sector, OECD standards tend to recognize the unique role played by these control points. So downstream companies, for example, can really make use of control points, leverage and visibility over other suppliers by checking to make sure that their control points are conducting due diligence to identify and prevent and mitigate risks at more remote areas and upstream tiers of their supply chain. And since this handbook addresses adverse environmental impacts in the mineral sector from the point of extraction through to key points of transformation, downstream companies can really use the handbook both to evaluate the due diligence practices of control points on risks and impacts further upstream, but also to identify and assess the impacts of the control point itself. The handbook is therefore addressed to all companies in the mineral supply chain, which may be causing, contributing, or directly linked to actual or potential adverse environmental impacts. But finally, it's important to note that this handbook may also be useful for more kind of sector-wide and multi-stakeholder initiatives that facilitate collaboration on due diligence activities, and for workers or trade unions and workers' representatives or civil society organizations, including, for example, human rights defenders, who then can better understand the kind of due diligence expectations on companies in mineral supply chains as well.
You mentioned before that not just multinational companies, but also SMEs might make use of the handbook. What's the benefit for an SME making use of the handbook?
Although our instruments often refer to multinational enterprises, they really are available and accessible and useful to companies of all sizes. So really from the very largest to small and medium-sized enterprises operating in kind of developing and developed countries. And the due diligence approach is adaptable, and the idea is that you can adapt it to your specific circumstances. It's tailored to the size and extent of your operations. So the handbook itself, we do address at certain points within the handbook specifically how SMEs might adapt to this particular step or this particular part of the due diligence process to their own particular circumstances. So we've done our best to kind of make sure that the handbook speaks to companies and enterprises of all different kind of sizes and means.
Rashad, let's talk about benefits. How can companies benefit from applying the OECD Handbook?
Well, the key differentiating factor with this handbook versus other existing audit protocols and other private industry-led frameworks is that this handbook is firmly rooted in the 6-step due diligence process and that approach from the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises and the due diligence guidance for responsible business conduct. This approach for addressing supply chain risks is backed by 51 governments, and it's seen as the de facto standard for mineral supply chain due diligence. And it's the standard towards which other industry-led auditing frameworks are seeking to align. So while the handbook itself is not a legal instrument, it follows the same approach and simply recontextualizes the OECD due diligence framework for this particular issue. So the primary benefit is for businesses seeking to take that recognized standard approach and then apply it to this particular risk.
Could you please explain to our audience a little bit more in detail this 6-step approach?
So the OECD risk-based due diligence approach, it not only helps ensure that the most significant impacts are addressed, it helps ensure that due diligence is practically implementable for companies. So for environmental risks in particular, given their widespread and dispersed nature in mineral supply chains, companies won't be able to identify and respond to every impact and every risk in their supply chain. They won't be able to monitor and track every business partner or trace every product simultaneously. So what this risk-based approach does is it doesn't expect perfect results and risk-free supply chains overnight, and it doesn't penalize companies for the presence of risks in their supply chain. And instead expects companies to take a systematized approach to prioritize risks appropriately, to make progress in a steady way, in a way that's practical and implementable, targeting the highest risk operations and business relationships, and then demonstrating meaningful progress over time through time-bound targets and indicators. And our instruments go into detail as to what exactly these indicators mean and these metrics and targeted approaches are.
There are other due diligence, risk assessment, and auditing frameworks already in place in the mining sector. What is the difference to these due diligence schemes to the OECD Handbook? Is the OECD Handbook just an umbrella?
So those due diligence schemes, some of them had been developed prior to the original OECD framework in 2011. Others came after. What we're seeing now is largely aligned, generally seeking to align with the OECD framework from the different schemes. So what the OECD framework does is it acts as sort of a standard of standards, a framework of frameworks, to which other industry-led programs that are much more specific or much more targeted to certain members or to certain segments of the supply chain are then seeking to align with. So it's sort of overarching in that sense, but it's also very targeted in other ways.
Jan, could you tell us a little bit about the background? How was the handbook developed? How long took it, and who was involved?
The initial spark for this project was actually a recommendation from a research project which I supervised at the German Environment Agency back in 2017. And the project analyzed sustainability standard systems in mineral supply chains and concluded that there is a lot of guidance on human rights, but very little specific guidance on how to address environmental issues, although the mineral sector is definitely a high-risk sector also in this regard. So I took up this recommendation in my role as a scientific policy advisor, and proposed to the German Environment Ministry that it should initiate an international process to develop such guidance. And this proposal finally found its way in the revised German raw material strategy, which was passed in 2019. And then the German national contact point for the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises presented this project idea to the OECD Working Party on Responsible Business Conduct in late 2020. The German Environment Ministry provided the funding, and then the OECD Center for Responsible Business Conduct took over and developed this handbook in a participatory multi-stakeholder process.
Did you pick and choose the stakeholders who were then involved, or did they simply raise the hand or show up and said, I want to be involved? And whoever wanted to be involved has been involved.
Yes, that was the case. Well, I didn't pick the stakeholders, that's for sure. We discussed possible candidates for the expert working group, or which we would like to have in the expert working group with the OECD and BGR. But then we had a kickoff event, which was a side event or a partner session hosted by the German Environment Agency at the 2021 OECD Minerals Forum, and there we had this kickoff event where we presented this initiative and invited everybody who's interested to join and to become part of this process. So it was an open process.
Do you think that involving a broad diversity of stakeholders gives the handbook more credibility or more content at the very end?
In this development process with the expert working group, we encountered the challenge that actually environmental issues in mineral supply chains are quite complex, are quite diverse, can be quite different, and also, complex in terms of time and spatial time lags and so on. And so we rather encountered this challenge that to keep this handbook practical, being concise, being sound by describing the possible environmental risks in mineral supply chains, but at the same time keeping it practical, keeping structural clarity so that business understand how they can approach it. So we more or less encountered the challenge how to cut things down, rather reduce the content and without losing anything.
As you were one of the founding fathers, basically you have the whole process in your mind. What lessons learned would you derive from this process to other multi-stakeholder dialogues? Is there anything you would like to share for people who initiate multi-stakeholder dialogues in other areas?
I think it's really important for this kind of handbook, which is meant to be applied globally and in very different contexts. It's very important to have a good representation of the people working with the handbook, but also of the people affected by the potential adverse effects in mineral supply chains. So it's really key to select the stakeholders to be included very wisely, to have a good acceptance and a good representation of the issues, and not only the issues but also the possible measures to mitigate or prevent these adverse effects.
Sophia, let's talk briefly about the content. What does the handbook contain?
So the handbook itself is, as I've mentioned before, is kind of intended to help downstream enterprises such as your metal traders, in exchanges, component manufacturers, product manufacturers and retailers understand how they can embed environmental considerations into their existing supply chain due diligence processes, while also helping upstream enterprises. So your miners, local traders and exporters, smelters and refiners, as well as recyclers, meet these due diligence expectations of their customers and other downstream business relationships. The handbook applies to all minerals and metals, including construction materials, industrial minerals, base metals, precious metals, gemstones, and technology critical elements, amongst others. The handbook, as Jan mentioned in one of his previous answers, really considers a very wide range of environmental risks and impacts that may arise in mineral supply chains from the point of extraction through those key points of transformation. And these include climate change, biodiversity loss and damage to protected areas, the degradation of land, marine and freshwater ecosystems, deforestation, air, water and soil pollution, mismanagement of a waste, including kind of hazardous substances, noise and vibration, damage to aesthetics, water depletion. So really, we try to cover a broader range of environmental impacts as possible. But given the broad range of environmental risks and adverse impacts that are covered in the handbooks and the various ways that these can manifest in different contexts, the handbook doesn't try to be exhaustive. Well, it cannot be exhaustive, and it doesn't go into extensive detail for each of the environmental risk areas. Instead, what it really tries to do is instead provide examples or points of reference that directing readers to additional resources for further kind of technical information on best practice or for assessing and preventing and mitigating environmental risks and adverse impacts. Very kind of simply, the handbook is broken down into 3 sections. The first one provides the background on why risk-based environmental due diligence matters to the mineral sector, and it considers how environmental due diligence can be undertaken in the context of 2 important topics in the mineral sector. First, artisanal and small-scale miners, but also the emergence of kind of recycled secondary materials and their use. The second part of the handbook clarifies what is meant by adverse environmental impacts, particularly in light of the updated guidelines for multinational enterprises on responsible business conduct. And it provides examples of common environmental issues that are found upstream in mineral supply chains. It also aims to help businesses understand factors that might affect the severity and likelihood of these environmental risks. And then the third section, which is really kind of the meat of the handbook, introduces how environmental risks and impacts can be integrated into the OECD's 6-step due diligence framework, and leads readers through each of the 6 steps, answering kind of specific questions on how businesses can address environmental considerations under each of those very well-established 6 steps of due diligence.
Does the handbook also contain best practice cases with very concrete descriptions how company applied it?
So there are a couple of case studies. There aren't a huge number. We didn't go into very much detail on specific instances or specific cases, because each of those cases are so particular to the region in which the company was operating in, the specific environmental impact, the specific pollutant or whatever. It becomes so niche that it was then difficult for a business. It would have then been difficult, I think, for companies and businesses to kind of extrapolate or take lessons learned from that. We do have a couple, but they're ones that we felt could be kind of the most useful and most broadly applied, I think. So we try to point to additional resources and examples as opposed to them explicitly kind of detailing them within the handbook itself.
Will there be a need for an update in the future?
Not necessarily an update, but I think we could see the need for additional resources that focus on more specific issues and more specific topics, if that makes sense. So the handbook, as I mentioned, is very broad. It covers a very wide range of environmental issues. It's a kind of starting point in terms of environmental due diligence in the mineral sector. I think what we could see going forward is potentially deep dives onto specific topics, such as on secondary materials, on recycling, such as on the interplay between human rights and environmental due diligence. I think going forward, that's where we could see kind of additional work being done, is on certain issues that are particularly challenging for businesses in supply chains.
Gudrun, let's talk about expected impacts. How will the handbook improve environmental impacts in the mineral supply chain?
First, I think the handbook will lead to increased and more structured communication on environmental issues and awareness on what is relevant in mineral supply chains. I think it can give more clarity which issues are relevant and what to ask your suppliers. And as a result, I would hope that transparency and information on environmental impacts increases, as this is a first step to understand and address these risks. Interest and communication in supply chains has already started for some issues, for example, for the carbon footprints or for risk in tailing dam failures. But for other aspects, environmental aspects, such as biodiversity, we don't see much of it yet. And I hope that can be increased. And as we have seen in human rights due diligence, international expectations have an impact not only on improving company practice, but also to be taken up by international industry standards, such as the London Metal Exchange or industry initiatives. And they also have been taken up in national regulations and monitoring processes in countries such as in DRC. And I hope this can also drive responsible practice in these countries in general to reduce environmental impacts on the ground. However, as everybody knows, and we all know, it's due diligence is not a silver bullet related to impacts, and lessons learned from the human rights due diligence show that some issues such as illegal gold mining and related criminal networks are still, after more than a decade, a major issue in these supply chains. And for example, related to illegal mining, there's also the issue of mercury use in protected areas and contamination. So I think we cannot expect this to be solved easily. But on the other hand, we see more end producers directly engaging on a mining level and with the processing industry to ask for high environmental standards and also include the local perspectives in their engagement. I think that's a very positive sign. So in the end, the impact very much depends on the global uptake and also very much if due diligence can be a business case for these companies. So we'll see in future how that works out.
You said environmental impacts will depend on the global uptake of the handbook. Who are the key players that need to take it up, that need to change their practices?
First of all, I think, of course, these are the ones that Sophia already mentioned, and also the so-called control points, the processing industry, but also investors and manufacturers. And also governments play a major role in changing practices on the ground, although they are not part of the supply chain directly. So refineries and processes are, I think, in a key position to ask their suppliers on environmental performance. And currently, it seems reporting on environmental issues is very limited at that level. At mining level, on the other hand, we already have more standard systems and assessments of responsible practice, and that can definitely support due diligence. And as I mentioned, investors, changing practices is often also a question of cost and investment. For example, for additional water treatment, for improved waste, or tailings management, or new infrastructure for energy, for renewable energy, for example. Therefore, banks and also investors play a key role to incentivize improving environmental performance, and maybe also sanction low performers. And especially for environmental issues, there's a strong need for governments to minimize environmental risks through their licensing processes for mining, because this is at an early stage, they can prevent high risks from the beginning and also monitor and sanction non-compliance. So I think these are the major key actors that should go into that, drive that issue.
Is there a need to communicate the key issues in a different way when we talk about investors, industries, mining, smelting, processing industry, and governments? Or can the handbook address all of them in parallel with the same messages, with the same content?
Yes, I think you would need tailored approaches of communication. For the mining industry, I think it's pretty clear already what to do, what are internationally accepted standards. It's also a very technical issue, so that really can be understood by mining industry, but so far several aspects are not so well understood in the downstream or by investors that look at a broad investment portfolio. That's why I think we really need to educate and raise awareness on the specific issues, and all these issues are very dependent on the local situation, on the local context. Geology is not something you can move from one place to another. So these are very specific issues that I think we need to communicate specifically.
The handbook focuses on environmental impacts. Are there any links to societal and human rights impact?
Yes, I think, of course, they are closely linked. It's obvious, for example, for water, access to water, water quality, for the living conditions of the local communities, that mining or also processing can impact these people. And for example, if you're a downstream company and you're looking at freshwater use, there's the question to ask, is there sufficient clean water for livelihoods of local communities? Has it been prioritized and respected? And these are aspects that really link environmental and social issues. Others are that conflicts are often related to concerns of communities about environmental issues, about water resources or contamination. So this could also lead to human rights violations, for example, against environmental defenders. So there's also a strong link. And the third aspect that I would like to raise is that there are legacies, or might be legacies, and future generations might be strongly affected, for example, by contaminated environments, by acid mine drainage that lasts for decades. So restoration and sustainable closure are key for development of these local communities after mining. Therefore, it's very important to include these in due diligence aspects.
Rashad, let's briefly talk about the business case. At least to my experience, many companies perceive responsibility for global supply chains as demanding, as costly, and often as an additional burden. Did you also find cases where companies could gain competitive advantages out of responsible sourcing?
Yes, it's true that that's often the initial reaction for companies when being approached with new standards and new ways of doing business. But as we've seen since 2011, when this responsible business conduct practice was really established and when it first took off, other than just being good business, supply chain due diligence is good for business. And sorry for the cliche line, but it definitely applies here. So for many companies, the business case is a matter of compliance with the law or pressure from business relationships facing compliance burdens of their own. So the OECD and other governments that have committed to promoting implementation of our standards represent nearly half of global GDP. And nearly 80% of global trade is linked to the production networks of multinationals that are often based in OECD jurisdictions. So when our governments, when OECD governments have made supply chain due diligence a legal requirement for businesses, those businesses then cascade those expectations through their supply chains. So on top of regulatory requirements, you also have industry self-regulatory bodies, such as the certification schemes that we talked about earlier, and commodity exchanges as well, that are also increasingly conditioning membership or trade on their platforms with undergoing an audit on your supply chain due diligence practices. So in effect, this means that the market access for responsible business is growing. Initially, many of these programs were focused on human rights issues and conflict finance issues, terrorist finance, money laundering. But as we've seen in the last few years, and as many governments have taken up, the environmental issue and environmental due diligence in supply chains is increasingly being demanded. So that's the legal compliance costs and the business case on legal compliance. But even in situations where responsible business remains voluntary, the cost of failing to act responsibly is often underestimated. And numerous studies that we've conducted at the OECD, but also that some other organizations have done themselves, show that companies face significant reputational damage and logistics costs when they don't have robust due diligence systems in place. We've seen that in the short term, there are benefits, but it's really, especially in the long term, where those benefits manifest themselves. And for example, as we saw during the pandemic, with the supply chain shocks happening then, companies that took proactive steps to know their supply chains, to make those supply chains more resilient, to address risks related to, for example, worker health and safety, those companies were able to build more short-term viability, and also build medium-term and long-term resilience and recovery. So those are some examples of the business case. I think if I can give one more example, we've seen the business case manifest itself in sustainable finance. A survey we conducted at the OECD a few years ago showed that businesses reported more favorable terms for finance and more access to finance in high-risk contexts in cases where they were able to demonstrate robust supply chain due diligence practices.
So did I get it right that one part of the business case is about compliance and one part is about preventing image damages, and the benefit is avoiding something? Can you gain something out of it as well?
Well, this is a risk management framework.
Yeah.
So really the primary benefits are avoiding those risks manifesting themselves. But there are some identified short and long-term benefits as well. So attracting talent, retaining talent has been shown to be linked to supply chain due diligence. Other studies that we've done in the past show that stock valuation tends to remain more stable for companies that undertake risk management processes. And also, as I mentioned, access to finance. So I consider that a benefit as well.
Are there any framework conditions, national, international regulations that we should change to create better synergies of responsibility and competitiveness on a global scale?
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. So I think, the benefits manifest themselves the best. I think this relates directly to the business case. The benefits manifest themselves the best when there is a whole of supply chain approach to due diligence. And given that supply chains are so global, that can only be truly implemented when you have synergies and coherence among the different standards that are popping up. So we need greater uptake among regulators, among industry bodies, among market makers, and other big industry players in order to see sustained benefits of due diligence over time. And in order to further disincentivize and shrink the market for irresponsible business practices. I think this is something that we struggled with from the very beginning, and unfortunately we still continue to struggle with, and that's that there's still a market for irresponsibly sourced minerals. And so, in cases where we've seen uptake, we also need to see greater alignment and enforcement around a common set of government-backed principles.
First of all, I would like to thank all of you for your precious time and these valuable insights into the content and context of the new OECD Handbook. It's a great pleasure to get first-hand insights from the ones who developed this document. We all sincerely hope that it will have substantial positive effects on transparency, responsibility, and sustainability of global supply chains. And if you would like to learn more about the handbook in particular, or more general on responsible sourcing, please visit our website, resourcing.eu.